The events of the last 9 days in Russia have left many questions. First and foremost, how firm is President Vladimir Putin's grip on power today? To answer that and much more, I have asked David Remnick to join me here in New York, and Nina Khrushcheva is with us from Moscow. David is the longtime editor of The New Yorker. Beginning in 1988, he spent 4 years in Moscow reporting for The Washington Post. His first book on Russia received the Pulitzer Prize. It is called Lenin's Tomb, The Last Days of the Soviet Empire. Nina is a professor of international affairs at the New School and is notably the great-granddaughter of the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Her latest book is In Putin's Footsteps. Nina, what is the mood in Moscow, and what do people think about this issue of is Putin consolidating his power, or is he now substantially weaker?
Well, Putin has been quite weak for quite some time. And one of the reasons, of course, is the war in Ukraine is now almost a year and a half in. Russia is not winning, despite all the expectations. So how not weak that power is. The choice, and this we talk about the coup or potential coup mutiny that didn't work out, is that the choice was between hardcore nationalists like Evgeny Prigozhin, who in his calls to the military, his interviews have been talking about cleansing Russia with blood, starting a new revolution, defending Russia from all enemies. Putin does the same thing, but it was more of kind of insidious nationalism, God-driven insidious nationalism with a lot of militancy, but most of it is outside of Russia. And so in this sense, the choice, of course, would be for Putin. And I was walking around Moscow, especially on Saturday during the mutiny, and people were saying quite openly, whatever we think of Putin, I still want my boy to go to school. I don't want him to be a child soldier. And so in this sense, Putin has consolidated his power. Well, consolidated. Putin has not lost his grip on power, at least not in the near run, although, of course, we know from Russian history, things can change at any moment. And David was a great witness to this. He left, I remember he left the Soviet Union and then had to come back to witness 1991.
David, it is a very different scenario, but describe to us what you think were the key, what was the key thing that happened to make that Soviet edifice of power collapse? Well, when you look at it now.
The collapse of the Soviet Union had all kinds of reasons that were economic, political, technological, lagging behind. And there was a leader of the Communist Party, that institution which ruled the Soviet Union, that felt it was time for a change. You don't have that now. Yeah. You're in quite a different position. I think what's so significant, or one of the things that's so significant about what just happened, is that the regime in Russia is a personalized regime. There are aspects to it that are a mafia regime in the way that they relate to each other, but it's entirely centered on one man, and it's a creation that's accumulated over 23 years. What happened in the past week is that the sense of mystery was removed. This is so important, the sense of ubiquity and all-knowingness, and that Putin knows best, and if something goes wrong, the Tsar didn't know, in the old phrase. And now we see his ordinariness. We see the fissures in the regime, and people are starting to look past Putin. That is a crucial thing. Yes, he may stay in power for a very long time to come. Even in the communist times, I remember there was an attempt made on Nikita Khrushchev that didn't succeed, but then some years later, of course, it did, and he was thrown out of power, and Brezhnev eventually took the seat.
And in his case, he was thrown out of power in part because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the sense that he
wasn't strong enough.
He wasn't strong enough, and he failed in an international crisis.
And he was deemed to be by the Communist Party too erratic in his public statements. There are all kinds of reasons for that. With Putin, it's a sense that, look, he's in power for a very long time. And the fact that this could happen on his watch is immensely embarrassing and humiliating. There's no question. And Prigozhin was a critic that was useful for a long time to Putin. He balanced out Shoigu and the defense establishment, and this was useful to him in his way of seeing the world. Now,
setting his elites against
Prigozhin then went on Telegram and said he never should have invaded in the first place. This was a gigantic mistake, even though he was fighting the war, and in his view, effectively.
Nina, I got to ask you about this issue that you've raised, which seems to me the central one, which is, do Russians fear instability? Do Russians fear the alternative to Putin as being either a kind of crazy nationalist like Prigozhin or just the collapse of things? Do they still have memories of the 1990s where, things really did, society almost collapsed, Russian GDP contracted by 50%. Is all that going to help Putin?
I think it is helping Putin to some degree. Of course, many people do not remember 1990s, but the older people do remember. And these are actually people who support him more than others, precisely because they had that memory when, everybody was wiping, as the way they think about it, everybody was wiping their feet over Russia. And so Putin had put a stop to that. And in fact, actually, Putin now uses the Prigozhin mutiny so effectively. That is, you don't like me and you don't think I'm stable. Well, but look what happened, what could have happened then. And so stability, especially because Russian history is one giant history of crisis all the time. You wrote this piece about demographic issues, Fareed. They know that their life really, corruption is part of that, is that your life is going to be over anytime soon, so you'd better steal more. You'll have to figure out how you can live without being shaken more. And in this sense, actually, Putin uses his power incredibly effectively.
Stay with us. When we come back, I'm going to ask David and Nina what all this means for the war in Ukraine. Back with David Remnick of The New Yorker, here with me on set, and Nina Khrushcheva joins us from Moscow. David, let me ask you, it seemed to me the most significant thing that Prigozhin said in his rambling 11-minute Telegram monologue was a pretty frontal attack on the rationale for the war in Ukraine.
That's right. Remember, for months and months, Prigozhin would go on Telegram with this message app system that lots and lots of people look at in Russia. And in the most profane language, which is very attractive, it's something that Putin used to do and really kind of get a rise out of ordinary people. His critique was aimed at Shoigu and Gerasimov and the leaders of the military effort in Moscow. It was directed at Moscow. We are here fighting the war in Ukraine, and you and your palaces in Russia don't care about people getting killed. And it was a competency argument. That changed. In the latest rant, in most recent rant, it had to do with the rationale of going in the first place. Now, he didn't direct it absolutely at Putin. He didn't say Putin did this for some pernicious reason. He said that he was manipulated by the defense establishment, but he did say there was no need to invade. And if you had said that as a left-leaning school teacher or a NGO activist, you would find yourself in jail. But there was quite something else hearing that from somebody who at least pretends to be the most effective defense asset that the Russian army had. And that, I think, sank in. And I think, and Nina can tell us better, that these kind of things also reached state television, which is very important. The critiques of the war were not reaching state television. Now this activity has bubbled up certainly to the newspapers that I'm reading in Russian. And I would imagine it's even gotten to the level of the propagandists on television, which is very important.
Nina, that is David puts it exactly right. Are people aware that Prigozhin argued that the Ukrainians did not attack, there was not a neo-Nazi attack, that this was all being done by Russia, and his argument is because the Russians who were dominating the Donbass wanted to extract even more from Ukraine? No. According to polls, the majority of Russians think that. But
actually, if you read polls correctly, they may not be the majority. Probably 20% think that firmly, 20% think some of it, 20% is absolutely against it, probably even more, and 40% even, maybe even more, think just leave us alone. It's your war, you fight it, you began it, it doesn't go well, but we're just trying to survive. And I think one of the kind of difficult to understand things about Russia, it's not necessarily a coherent space. It's not a coherent country. It's not coherent ideology in any way. And one of the main symbols of it is a double ego, and I use it as an explanation all the time, but it's important. I mean, that part of the schizophrenia is part of the Russian psyche. So yes, now they question the beginning, whether we need it or not. But the thing is, we're almost a year and a half into that war. So who is going to look at the beginning? Now the question, and that's what the propagandists do, now we need to win. Because imagine that Russia is going to lose all of it, 11 time zones. So the argument shifted, and that's why I don't believe it hurts Putin that much.
David, the whole thing does sound somewhat terrifying, particularly the way you described it, which was Putin's vertical of power, as he called it. It's totally personal. You know, when you think about if she were to die in China, we know what would happen. The Communist Party Central Committee would elect a new...
It provides, you know, you may not like it,
Right.
but there's a coherence and a logic, and he and his personality are central to it.
But in his case, if
But
he
you can
goes...
imagine a future after it.
Right, exactly. If Putin goes, you have these 11 time zones, the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, veto in the Security
Correct.
Council. Could the Russian state just collapse?
I don't know. I mean, I should say that the key word here that people talk about in Russia to describe power in that structure is clans, not parties, not civic organizations and constituencies, but clans. Clans within the FSB, clans within the Interior Ministry, within the Defense Ministry, all the rest. So there are factions, and there's no raving liberals, that's for sure. But the difference between the temperament, at least, of the prime minister and the mayor of Moscow is quite different than some of the factions that you would see in the intelligence area, in the FSB. But I don't think we should sit around waiting for a Gorbachev, much less a Sakharov, to emerge post-Putin. It is a colossal mess.
Nina, what do you think Putin's fate is in a situation where he does not achieve his objectives in the war in Ukraine?
As for Putin, I think David also mentioned something about gangster state, which Putin, the relationship are very gangstery, and so he's in charge, sort of the Robert De Niro in his best roles. And we do know when power shows weakness, when it kind of goes and the clans are, even if they're fighting amongst themselves, they're still needing that icon in front of them. I mean, that picture in front of them, because they don't know who among them is going to win. So the man on top is a very useful tool for them to kind of center around and fight it out while he's still there. And the same thing is happening with Putin. So if he goes, we don't know what that fight between clans are going to happen. And as David said, it's not going to be, it doesn't look like Gorbachev can be, or even Khrushchev can be part of that scenario. So it would be the Siloviki, the power ministries, the FSB, the army, the clandestine services, and these are not pretty people. So for now, for all of these clans, it's convenient to have Putin, and that's the source of his power. So he kind of take them one against another and stays on. And so in this sense, actually, the stalemate war is convenient for him, because as long as he fights that, as long as he doesn't give up, he continues to be the president.
I should point out that there is, in a sane world, an opportunity to signal a transition. There's an election coming up in Russia, and Putin has, in the past, appointed a successor figure and allowed that successor to at least putatively be president for a while, Dmitry Medvedev. He could do that again. Now, Dmitry Medvedev has become an incredible extremist in an attempt to regain his stature in the Putin political establishment these days. I doubt that he would return as a putative president or a future president. But Putin could, now that he's in his 70s, now that he's been in power for 23 years, and now he has this disaster in front of him, he could, in a sane world, at least indicate some political preference for a successor figure, either to replace him semi-immediately or down the road, and make it kind of obvious where his in the interest of some kind of authoritarian stability. It's not clear that he'll do that, because it's not clear that he trusts that process won't undermine him and his power, because, it's like the old dictator who would begin a speech, "If I die."
Thank you both very much. This is a fascinating conversation, about the riddle wrapped in the mystery inside the enigma, as Churchill said. Next on GPS, my next guest says the world's rich countries bear the lion's share of the responsibility for causing climate change. So why shouldn't they pay to clean it up? I'll be back with the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, in a moment.